everyone. So today we're looking at 2.12, the effects of migration. And our tidbit of the day is that the national animal of Scotland is the unicorn. Our learning objective for the day is to explain historical and contemporary geographic effects of migration. So we're looking at political, economic, and cultural effects. We're going to start out by looking at policy. Focusing realistically on U.S. policy, we've seen a few different things throughout history. So we'll start with the Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears happens in the 1800s with the Indian Removal Act in particular. And this is the forced migration of Native Americans. Particularly, we're talking about the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. Tribes that were traditionally in the southeast of the United States who were forced out of their lands. It begins because they have really desirable lands to start with. And then when gold is discovered in these places, the white Europeans and the white Americans want this land even more. So in 1830, we have the Indian Removal Act, which basically has the U.S. military come in and force the native populations off of their lands further and further westward. And so today, we still see most of our native populations live in the western portion of the United States, many of them on reservations. And this is often in the driest areas, the least arable land, basically the places that the white Europeans or white Americans did not want. In the early part of the 20th century to the mid part of the 20th century, we have the Great Migration, and we kind of see this in a couple of different steps. But overall, this takes place from about 1916-ish, a little earlier, to 1970. During this time period, we have more than 6 million Black Americans move from the American South to the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. And particularly, they're going to the industrialized cities in these regions. This is going to forever change the demographic makeup of the entire country. So at first, we had about 90% of Black Americans living in the South. But by the 1970s, about half of them live in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. So we see a lot of Black Americans in northern cities still, in New York, in Pittsburgh, in Detroit, and farther west in places like Los Angeles and in the Bay Area in California, in Seattle. This happens due to a couple of reasons, and so we could look at it as both forced and voluntary migration. More on the forced side, we have the Jim Crow laws, we have racial discrimination and violence. These are things that take place after the emancipation of the slave. So they put the Jim Crow laws in place. Jim Crow refers to an extremely racist, negative stereotype around Black people. Basically, these are continuing on the ideas of slavery without technically enslaving human beings. Then we look at the economic side of it. A lot of our Black Americans were coming from, at early on, the plantations where they'd worked, so the only jobs that they were able to get was to continue sharecropping or to continue working on those plantations through sharecropping, where they were essentially still enslaved, but technically free. But they made little to no money, and so therefore didn't have a whole lot of opportunity. Eventually, we start seeking out more opportunity, particularly through industrial work, and we're going to find that especially in the city. So we start going to the steel cities. We have the world wars, in which we're going to need quite a lot of labor. And interestingly, one of the things that we see during this time period is that eventually during World War II, we'll have German prisoners of war, so German soldiers who were captured during wartime, who will be shipped to the United States and housed here. They were used for labor, so the missing labor from the young men who were off fighting in the war, they would fill in spots. Oftentimes, there would be a significant preference for the German POWs rather than the Black Americans. In the 1920s, we began setting immigration quotas. These are limits on the number of immigrants that we will take in from particular countries, particular regions, and this continues for quite a few years, changing over time. With all of these immigration events, we see a lot of chain migration and kinship links. So kinship links are why we migrate through chain migration. So we have family members or friends in various places, so that's where we decide to go. And we see quite a lot of that, especially as we have Black Americans moving northward. When we have the opportunity to choose where to move, this often happens. Today, we still see quite a lot of immigration. So we have had a significant influx of Somali refugees since the 1990s. Many of them will go on to participate in further secondary migration. So they first migrate to the US and then they move once they get here. So they settle in one place at first and then go outward. This is part of that step migration. So we've seen growing Somali communities in places like Minneapolis, Minnesota, Columbus, Ohio, Lewiston, Maine. Minnesota in particular, we've seen a lot of secondary migration as immigrants move outward into smaller and more rural communities. We've also had quite a few Hmong refugees from Laos. This began in 1975. So during the Vietnam conflict, a lot of Hmong peoples fought alongside the US military. And when the new government came into power in Laos, the government threatens them. So what we see is a lot of Hmong fleeing to Thailand, which is a neighboring country. They'll live for years and years in refugee camps and eventually be settled in other countries, particularly the United States, but also France, Canada, Australia. And today we have pretty significant Hmong communities in California, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. So what's driving the policy? Mainly when we're deciding immigrants to accept immigrants or which immigrants to accept, it's largely about meeting labor needs. We may also put, and this we is a big term, it doesn't necessarily mean the United States. We put limits on immigrants from particular countries. This is primarily xenophobia. So xeno means foreigner. Phobia is fear. This is fear or dislike of foreigners. We also, on the other side, may loosen quotas for population diversification. When we're migrating, there are particular risks for female migrants. They tend to have fewer opportunities than male migrants, especially for things like work. They're often leaving restrictive laws or traditions in their home countries, and they tend to be more vulnerable to several things, including violence and sexual discrimination, as well as trafficking. So women are more likely to be victims of human trafficking. In the European Union, the EU, we see a large number of asylum seekers. This is partially due to proximity. Europe is much closer to a lot of peoples who are seeking asylum than other countries or other continents. It's also highly developed, so it's very desirable for many people. Not a lot of conflict going on in Europe anymore, so it's much safer, much more economically developed. This tends to put a greater strain on border countries. So when you have lots and lots of refugees or asylum seekers coming in, the number one place they're going to go is somewhere close by. So border countries with other continents or with the Mediterranean Sea are going to have more asylum seekers coming into them. It also means as people progress through, if they happen to be deported for whatever reason, they're most likely to go back to that origin country in the EU, more so than their country of origin from the beginning. We also have seen, especially from 2014 to 2017, a huge influx of undocumented entries, especially by boat. Places like Spain and Portugal and Italy, we have a lot of asylum seekers who are crossing the Mediterranean and doing so without documentation because they are asylum seekers primarily. In the United States, we've seen a few different things kind of driving policy, a few different examples of these policies. So in 1882, we have something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is going to suspend Chinese immigration in the US for more than 60 years. Due to continued renewal. So it starts out as 10 years and then continues to be renewed for quite a long period of time. By 1924, this is expanded to include nearly all Asian groups. So basically all Asian groups were excluded from being allowed to immigrate to the US. This will eventually be repealed in 1943, although quotas are going to continue to severely limit the numbers of Asian, African, and Arab immigrants, and that will largely remain intact until the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which opens the U.S. up to more diverse immigration. Following 9/11, we start to see significant discrimination against immigrants. Interestingly, this largely comes into play with very close immigrants. So we start to see stricter border patrol and immigration requirements. It makes it much more difficult to get into the US. And in particular, we see some disadvantages for Latin American immigrants. Those who are fleeing violence from Central America in particular are coming up through Mexico. That's a long journey. It's very dangerous to start with. And with very strict and tough border patrol and immigration policies, they're going to become more vulnerable to smugglers and more vulnerable to human traffickers. Women are much more likely to face things like rape and other violence. Men also are facing quite a bit of violence. They're much more likely to be murdered. Overall, what we see is limited protections against exploitation and abuse of people who are allowed into the US. Undocumented immigrants in country in particular are less likely to report crimes against them for fear of deportation. So violence, sexual violence, murders are much more likely to happen proportionally than they may be to the regular population. Very recently, so 2017 on, we've seen quite a significant change in a lot of things with immigration. So in 2017, we have restrictions put on immigrants from 7 Muslim majority countries. The idea is that these are meant to limit terrorist immigration, but this is largely criticized as a Muslim ban. Also in 2017, we see the revocation of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. This protected undocumented immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children. So we have parents immigrating without documentation, and they're bringing their children with them. This is meant to help those children. So it allows them to work, it allows them to go to college, it gives them protections that allows them to continue to live in the United States, which for many of them is the only home they've ever known. In 2018, the zero tolerance immigration policy is going to lead to the separation of children from their parents, and both will be held in various detention centers around the US. So parents are going to be criminally prosecuted, and that's going to mean that parents and children are separated. Poor documentation with this process is also going to further make it more difficult to reunite families. We're still suffering the repercussions of this, and we likely will be for many, many, many years. And that's nothing on what the children will experience or the families will experience, because we have, sometimes from very young ages, children who have been separated from their families now for at least a couple of years and likely will continue to do so for many years. So looking at some additional effects, now we're moving on to economic. And I call these consequences in here, but consequences doesn't necessarily mean bad. It's just the things that are happening. So for our destination countries, the places where the immigrants are going, immigrants are a source of labor. They're often more willing to accept low-paying or less desirable jobs than the native-born population. This is often in sectors like agriculture, construction, and service work. This is especially true for undocumented immigrants. Skilled and highly qualified immigrants are often paid less than their native-born counterparts. This is good for companies, not so great for the immigrants or even for the native-born workers, because they may be out of jobs because the companies are paying the immigrants less. We can also see that qualified immigrants reduce the skills gap. So this is the shortage of people trained in a particular industry. This is a really good thing. So if we need workers there and we have them, this is providing that source of labor. Another benefit that we see is immigrant entrepreneurship tends to be very high in core countries. So a lot of the times you have immigrants come into the country and they start businesses. We particularly see this in things like restaurants, but it's not exclusive to that. And they're often very popular, not only amongst immigrant communities, but also amongst native-born communities. Immigration changes the population growth and composition of the destination country as well. So we can see a lot more growth if we don't see a natural growth of the United States in particular. We know that most of our growth comes from immigration rather than the natural increase rate. It can also change that composition piece where instead of having so many of the native-born population in an area, we start having more diversity introduced into it. Another thing we see with the economic aspect of immigration is something called remittances. So remittances are money sent back home. And there's some positive and negatives here. It helps the country that it's sent back to, but it doesn't necessarily boost the country in which that money is earned because it's no longer there. It's being sent away. And we also see that a lot of resources may go to helping immigrants integrate into the new culture. So we might have citizenship classes, we may have language classes. Sometimes this is paid for by funds that could otherwise go elsewhere. On the countries of origin economic consequences, they tend to lose the working age population. We know from Ravenstein that these are the most common people to migrate. This could, however, lower unemployment rates. So if we have fewer workers in the pool, then more people have to go to work, meaning that there's less unemployment. If immigrants return to their countries of origin, and many do, they often bring home new skills or education. The remittances that we talked about on the last slide help to boost the local economy. So for example, the Philippines receives approximately 10% of its GDP from remittances, which is a huge amount of money, and we see billions of dollars across the globe in the form of remittances. And then finally, with economic consequences, we see something called brain drain. This is when highly educated or trained people leave the country to go work in another, often wealthier country. So it's good for the receiving country, but very bad for the country of origin because now they're losing out on this highly skilled or educated population. So some cultural consequences. Destination countries. Immigrants are bringing in their home culture. So we get new food, new music, literature, language, fashion, religion, all of these cool things. A lot of the times, as we said before, immigrants tend to be entrepreneurs. So they're bringing in this new cultural stuff. They have goods and services that may be very valuable to not only the immigrant populations, but the native-born populations as well. We receive this new culture through relocation diffusion. So this is essentially, it's a type of expansion diffusion. We pick up the culture and place it in the new spot. It's not removing it really from the old place. It's not gone from there. We're just moving it. We're taking it somewhere else. The cultural costs are often really only considered perceived. So they tend to only affect a small part of society. It's what that group tends to say, oh, they're costing us this. And ways that we might see this is the idea that a country's traditions are endangered by new customs. So there may be a perception that the culture is in danger from the new customs coming in. We may also see repercussions of this in forms of anti-immigration demonstrations, violence, and policies. One last thing here is that sometimes we have immigrants come into this new country and they lose some of their cultural identity to blend more into the receiving culture. This could be acculturation or assimilation. So acculturation, they kind of take on aspects while maintaining most of their own aspects of culture. Assimilation, they replace the old culture with the new. On the countries of origin, emigration can disrupt social structure. So families can be separated for years. Oftentimes we're seeing more young men leave than more young women. So this is going to disrupt our gender balance. Many times we may have young women who are unable to find partners. This could change our fertility rates overall and affect the population as a whole. And finally, dependency ratios become unbalanced. So a lot of our working population is leaving. We're left with the very young and the very old, and that throws off who is working and who is depending upon those workers. Okay, that's it. So we're explaining historical and contemporary geographic effects of migration. In your notes, I want you to do 3 things. First off, identify what factors might cause a country to create stricter immigration policies and use examples. Secondly, compare positive and negative economic effects of migration on destination countries and countries of origin. And finally, describe how ethnic diversity resulting from migration benefits the destination countries. I definitely urge you guys to look some of this up. Use your books, use your resources to find this. I'm going to post some other videos for you guys to watch from other sources than me. With that, make sure you go back and rewatch anything that you missed or need a little refresher on. Make sure you're reading in your books, and have a great day. Bye.